So tonight, we're looking, as you have there on the screen, at David the shepherd. David the shepherd. And we'll be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning there in verse 12. Let me go there. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Did I say that right? Verse 12? Yeah. Going through about verse 37 now. I was told that we have a break about 6:50, and so we won't rush too much here. But if you'll go and open your Bibles with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we're going to be looking at the first hour to the best of our ability, looking at verses 12 through 30 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. And really, when we look at this section, we find really the humble beginnings of David as a faithful shepherd. We have his responsibility, as we're going to see here. We find him being a humble shepherd. We find him being responsible. And we also find, more importantly than these other things, is his faith that he does not allow to waver. Even when his faith is, you might say, misunderstood. If you look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're not going to read through this other because this is our main text, 12 and following. But 1 through 11, you had the Philistines and the Israelites are encamped for war. The Philistines and Israelites are encamped for war in verses 1 through 11. And this really just paints the picture of what is really taking place. And we think about those things. We think about what their actions say in verses 1 through 11. By them being encamped for war, it tells us that they are going, well, we know they're going against who? Who's their enemy? Yeah, right. The Philistines are coming up and going to war against the people of God, right? And we find verses 10 through 11 that Goliath taunts Israel daily. And you might say, if you back up there, verses 10 and 11, that he almost paralyzes them with fear because they're not doing anything, right? We look at verse 10 and 11 in 1 Samuel 17. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Fear can do a lot of things, can it? Is it fair to say that sometimes fear can cause us to act irrational? It can cause us to believe that something is going to happen that maybe down the line actually doesn't even take place, right? You know, we think about how we're told not to worry there in Matthew chapter 6. And I think we find here a reminder of that, but here in a different sense because we're talking about going to war, right? And so in verses 10 and 11, he comes out and he basically taunts God's army. And no one steps up, right? Look at verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Had God ever helped his people win battles before 1 Samuel 17? Only all the time, right? Only all the time. So is it logical to say that their fear doesn't make any sense? Now, granted, as you have back here in the wall, we don't see 9-foot giants in battle. We see probably big guys, I'm sure, in battle. But a 9-foot giant who comes out and taunts the entire army, as the Bible says there in verse 10 and 11 every day, is something pretty impressive in and of itself, right? I mean, he's obviously not afraid. But could it be said that he doesn't realize who it is he's going up against? Because when Israel as a people are doing that which is right and God is with them, do they ever lose? No. The only time they ever lose is when they don't do what God says and God tells them, for example, don't go up to a certain battle, and what do? Well, they go on up anyway, and they get demolished, right? Well, of course, because you disobeyed God, of course you're going to fail. And rightfully so, right? Why do you think sometimes that it may appear that God chooses people like David, chooses someone who is unexpected to do battle and to be an example of faith. Was it unexpected in the New Testament when Christ appeared to Saul? Probably not to us, because you read this story in the account thousands of times, right? But living in that time period, did they expect Saul to be converted? No, that's why they feared him for a long time after his conversion, right? So, did they expect David, who couldn't even wear the armor, to go out and fight Goliath, let alone kill Goliath? No. I think we can say they didn't expect that because they themselves weren't even going out, verses 10 and 11, right? They were afraid to go out. Fear makes us act in an irrational way. If you look there in verses 12 through 15 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I don't want to talk all night. I've already taught one class and preached. My voice won't last, so go ahead.
It's interesting because when you look at David, they didn't expect him because it's the complete contrast of what would be expecting someone to go into this type of battle. Right?
Yeah.
It's the complete contrast. It's like everything that you go measure. Okay, is this a warrior? Is this a soldier? Nope. When you look at David, he's not tall. He's not strong. He's not, and so I think just from application perspective is looking at this example, and you might go into this as just, we might think that we can't overcome this or that or whatever, but we know God in our life, we can overcome it.
Exactly.
And I think that's exactly what the story here connects to. So.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead, Nan.
Why would God choose someone like that? I think it's interesting because it's not necessarily that God thought that was the man that was most fit. It's just the idea, kind of like Johnny was saying, Romans chapter 8, if God be for us, who can be against us? It's not that David was the only man that could have done that. It was that David was the only man that stepped up to do the job.
Yes. David's the only one that stepped up. And I think, honestly, and to y'all's point, who would you expect to go up? Some seasoned guy who's slayed a lot of people, right? Some guy who's got kinks in his armor because he's fought so many battles and been so good. And that same guy is sitting aside saying, yeah, David's about to get mauled. That's what they expected. I mean, you think about what that situation, and I don't get to talk about the battle itself. When I picked this lesson, I thought it was going to be talking about the battle. I was getting all pumped up, really talking about Braveheart style kind of stuff. But I don't get to do that. I get to stop right before it. I get to be teased with it. But anyway, we may venture into there, but that's okay. But in verses 12 through 15, you have David's background, right? And someone wants to read verses 12 through 15 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. To verse 15.
But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem.
Okay, so 12 through 15 here. To summarize here what we just saw, Jesse is advanced in years. David is the youngest of 8 sons. That is a big family, right? Anybody here ever seen the Waltons? That's a big family, right? Well, so you picture David being kind of that kind of family, but he's the youngest guy. And what's interesting, if you look at the Hebrew, it says here that the youngest can also mean least significant in status. I don't like that one because I'm the youngest, so I don't like that one. But with David, that could have been part of it because you look at how his brothers talk to him, they look at him like he's the least significant, right? Because he's back home taking care of the sheep and all those kinds of things, and they're out at battle. And so in their mind, the least significant is back home, right? The 3 sons the three oldest sons are in the army. So, okay, so not all, but three of the oldest sons are in the army, verses 13 to 14. But David is at home. David, if we find verse 15, returns from Saul to feed his father's sheep. And this, no doubt, of course, this shows some responsibility, as we mentioned earlier. He goes home and he takes care of what he's supposed to because he's not yet going out to battle. He has responsibilities. In verse 15, he goes back home and does those things. You know, if David was the one who could not be trusted to take care of things at home and to fulfill his duties that were given to him by his father, you think David would have been a man who went out to war and showed great leadership and those kinds of things? Probably not. Because you think about it, if David didn't show responsibility at home and to some degree leadership at home by returning back and taking care of things, you think there's a good chance and maybe later he wouldn't become a leader? If he can't take care of the simplest tasks, right, like going back, feeding his father's sheep, I think it's an indication showing his responsibility and his maturity and how he wanted to do what was no doubt pleasing to his father and being obedient to his father's wishes, right, doing those kinds of things. We know in Luke 16 and verse 10, the Bible says, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much." You want to see if someone can do something big, give them something small first, right? Before you don't, you want to tell someone we want you to be we want you to be our preacher if you've never even done a devotional lesson, right? That'd be crazy. So what do? You have them do the least of things before they do anything even greater, right? Because if you can't handle the least of things, you can't handle the bigger stuff, right? What are some roles in our own lives where faithfulness is especially important? And let me put it this way. What are some, we might say, small areas in our life that sometimes we might overlook that faithfulness is important? Is it important if your job is Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, is it important to be at work at 8 o'clock? If you're going to be faithful? Yeah. And if you're not faithful to show up at 8 o'clock and work till 5 o'clock, what's going to happen? Well, let me phrase. What used to happen? You probably get fired, right? You know, when I was growing up, I worked in restaurants and things. My birthday present when I was 16 was my parents took me to fill out a job application so I could get a job. Happy birthday. Okay. That's what they did. But, you know, if I couldn't have done those kinds of things, if I made excuses, didn't want to go, if I went in there and did everything, just haphazard and those kinds of things, didn't work hard like I was supposed to, what would have happened? They would have let me go, all right? Well, if I couldn't take care of a job like washing dishes at a restaurant, were my parents about to buy me a car? Well, I know the answer to that. There's no way. If David can't take care of things at home and be obedient to his father's wishes and be a servant at home and doing things he's supposed to do, you think God's going to appoint him as a leader? No. Go ahead.
You know, everything in life, as duties as a father or as a husband or as a Christian, everything has an amount of significance, whether it be small or large. And like you said, it's those small things that tend to be looked over, but there is significance in those things, and they can roll over into things of larger significance if those smaller things aren't done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as humans, we tend to overlook those things. If the bees didn't do their job on this earth, what would happen?
Yeah.
If the beavers didn't do their job on this earth, what would happen? You know, we like to watch all the Animal Planet stuff. It's just amazing the significance of these creatures. You know, I know they're not Christians, but it's the amount of things that we tend to overlook that make a huge impact.
Yeah. Yeah. The little stuff makes a difference, right? You know, if you go into a business, and I think about when I was younger, like I said before, I worked in restaurants because teenagers can work in restaurants pretty easily, right? But I remember we learned pretty quickly what would happen if the dishwasher didn't show up. Things went downhill really quickly. What happened if the cook didn't show up? Got rough pretty quick. And same thing with the waiter or waitress, right? If someone doesn't show up and do their part, even though they may think it's small, right? Well, it doesn't matter. There's so many other people there. It makes a difference. And to your point, if we don't do those small things that we don't think are important, we fail to realize just how really important they are, right? Then no one cleans a building for a week, 2 weeks, what happens? We know what happens. It gets dirty. It gets trash. Those kinds of things. Were you going to say something, Jim?
Yeah, I was going to say, even the small, doing the small things to lead to the big things, but I think action is what you're talking about, but also like what Bill was talking about this morning in the sermon is heart, right? It's like when you're doing them, are you doing them with a good heart, or are you just doing them because you have to do them? If you use the work example, like I can go to work 8 to 5, but if I'm not very nice and not doing my,
Yeah.
I can do something but not have the right attitude about it, I'm going to find myself the same thing.
Yeah.
And so, like David, just for example, he had that heart, and we know that God said he was a man after his own heart, but I think that plays a part too, is the action, but also the heart of what he's doing. He's the youngest kid, it's like, why I have to do this, why is everyone, whatever, picking on me or whatever,
Yeah.
but that's not the heart that he had.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to mention that as well, was that the only time you hear about David complaining in this is when he wanted to go out to war, right? When he's like, what are you doing sitting here, right? That's pretty bold for the youngest of 8 brothers to tell these older guys who are there. Remember, it's just the 3 oldest brothers who are there, and everybody else, what are you doing, right? I've had conversations with people of various ages, and over the years, I remember once, years ago, I was talking to a guy, and he was quite a bit older than me, and I was trying to encourage him to knock off whatever it was he was doing and come back. And there was a point in conversation, he got a little blunt, and I just told him frankly, if you want to go to heaven, you can't be doing this. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, because he was at least, at that time, 30 years older than me. But with David, he didn't care how old they were. He knew that they weren't doing what they should be doing. And to Johnny's point, you don't read about David complaining about any of that, anything, the mundane stuff. What he complains about is them not going out and shutting the mouth of Goliath. That's what he gets upset about. Not going home and taking care of the sheep. You look there in verse 15, the Bible just says he returned home to take care of to feed his father's sheep. It doesn't say he went home angry, upset that he had to go home. He didn't go home and complain that he had to go home. He didn't go home and do those things haphazardly. He went home and he fed his father's sheep. Because even the smallest things have to be done, right? Now let's go back for a second before we get to the next point. But if you go back to Luke chapter 16. And let's look again at Luke 16, looking at verse 10. And I want us to read this, the entire verse. Luke 16, verse 10 says, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much." But now notice, he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. You think, well, yeah, that makes sense. But sometimes we don't realize how bad it is to be unfaithful in just the least of things. I remember one time we had another location. I'm going to be clear. We had a sign sheet for a certain thing. And a certain family would sign up to do a task. And it was a month-long task. And they might do it once. And so I finally pulled a man aside and said, if you're not going to do it, don't put your name up there. Because putting your name up there is not fulfilling the task. Fulfilling the task is doing what you signed up to do, right? I mean, what's the point of putting your name on something and, yeah, I'll clean the building. You don't ever come up here and do it. Did you clean the building? No. And so he says, he that is unjust in the least is also unjust in much. Well, you're not going to give the person who's unjust or unfaithful or who you cannot count on in the least of things more responsibility, right? I mean, can you imagine the guy who barely shows up to work and comes in grungy clothes and you don't know how many days it's been since he showered? You want to give that guy a promotion? Give me a break. You're not going to do that. And that's the idea here. If he's not faithful in the small things, he wouldn't be faithful in the big things, right? I have that divided up there a little bit. Let's look at 17 through 20. 17 through 20. Let me get back to where I was. 1 Samuel chapter, somebody wants to read that. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 17 through 20.
And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle.
So we find David is being sent by his dad with food in orders to bring back a report. And we find there that he goes, he gives those things out, right? He carries those things. Verse 19 says, Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. But had they taken care yet of Goliath? No. Goliath's still out there, right? Verse 20. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him, and went to the camp as the army was going out to fight and to the fight, and shouting for the Bible for the battle, rather, not for the Bible. Now David rises early and leaves the sheep with the keeper. He doesn't neglect him, again showing what he can be counted on. He doesn't just run off, leaves him with the keeper. He shows obedience, but he also shows foresight, doesn't he? You can't just run off. I mean, just because he gives you an order doesn't mean you forget about what your responsibilities are, right? He takes care of those things as well. And we've already mentioned this a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but obedience and what we might consider to be mundane things is a mark of spiritual maturity. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 23, it says, And whatever you do, or what your hands want to do it heartily as to the Lord, Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do it with your all, right? It doesn't matter what the task is. And I've said it before, I don't know if I've said it here, but it doesn't matter if you're a person who cleans the church building, if you're a person who does the stream, a person who teaches the Bible class. Every single person is important. Every single role, every single task that's being taken on by a member is important. It doesn't matter what it is. If you want to annoy me, downplay how important it is to clean the building. Because somebody doesn't clean the building or prepare the Lord's Supper for Sunday, what's going to happen? Well, sometime at some point, we're all going to be sitting here going, where's the Lord's Supper? Because no one's done it, right? Every task is important. There is no such thing, especially in the Lord's church, as a mundane or meaningless or small or insignificant task or work. Everything is important. Everything is important. Okay. David's arrival and his reaction is seen in verses 21 through 30 here. We look at verses 21 through 26. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 21 through 26, if someone wants to read that. 21 through 26.
For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, who spake according to the same words that David heard. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to him, and stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and take away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?
Okay, thank you. So we find that when David arrives, Israel and Philistines are getting ready to go to battle, right? But what we're focused on here is Goliath. Not that just they're going against the Philistines, but we find in verse 22 David here leaves all his supplies that he brought, just like his father told him to. Left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper. Means he fulfilled what his father told him to do, right? As far as that goes. He's going to bring back a report. That was the other part. So he leaves his supplies with who he's supposed to. He ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. And then verse 23 and following, he's getting the report. So he's fulfilling everything his dad told him to do, right? Yeah, he's doing what he's supposed to do. Now, you look at verse 23 and 24. This is where David, you might say, started to get a little curious and maybe, and as we'll see later, a little upset about what hasn't taken place, right? Because notice how he talks about him. In verse 23, then as he talked with them, there was a champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up in the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. So David hears from Goliath the same thing he said before, right? In verse 24, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. What does verse 24 tell us that David also saw? He saw the army of God run away, didn't he? He saw them, as the Bible says in verse 24, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. David heard the same thing they did. Does it say David ran away? No. In fact, in verse 25, we find the men of Israel say, "What will happen if you kill Goliath? Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's exemption from taxes of Israel." I think it's funny they mention you get exempt from taxes, right? Even in the Bible, they hated taxes, right? It's a biblical thing. Anyway, but in verse 25, they say what's going to happen for the person who kills them, right? But also notice what they say in verse 25 concerning Goliath. Surely he has come up to defy Israel. That's enough to go to battle, isn't it? He has come up to do what? To pick a fight with the army of God. So what are they afraid of? Well, Goliath's big. He's intimidating. The Bible talks about later all his armor and things, right? And so he gives an intimidating picture. We have the thing up here that's nice and all, but Goliath was a beast, right? I think Adam's a big guy. I wouldn't want to see Goliath. Goliath's taller. Goliath is a big, experienced warrior.
He's on the back wall.
Yes, he's on the back wall. But that doesn't do him justice, though, does it? As much as that's funny. It doesn't do him justice, though, right? And we may get to it later. As I said before, my lesson stops before we get to talk about the Battle of Goliath. But in verse 25, the point is, the people knew that he was defying defying Israel, right? Now notice what David says in verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, now notice how he addresses him. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine? He's basically saying this guy's nothing. So what do we get when we kill him? David's not afraid. What do we get? Now, in verse 25, the Bible tells us what they're going to be given, right? I think a little bit here when David asks, what is he giving? What do we get if we kill him? By his reply and by his question, he lets them know how they should feel about that guy as well, right? Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? So obviously he says there was a reproach upon Israel. Why? Because Goliath is still out there. Verse 26, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? I think about it this way. David's saying, who is this guy think he is? Right? The armies of God, when the Lord was with them and with the armies, because that is specific, because the Lord isn't always with them, because sometimes they go to battles and pick their own battles and God just lets them reap what they sow, right? But every time he is with them, they never lose, right? Think of this for a second. And there was a camp theme of this a couple of years ago, undefeated, right? Same idea. Is God undefeated? Yeah. He doesn't lose. He lets his people be humbled when they're acting like uneducated people. But does he lose? No, not ever. Right? This is the same God who tells his army, look, there's too many of you. We need to downsize, because if you go out with the, whatever it was, thousands of people you have, you're going to get the credit. So we're going to dwindle you down to about 300 people. Then we're going to go out and we're going to kill everybody. And who gets the glory? God does. Right? That was the point of that, was they brought down their army so that they couldn't say, we did this all of our own. No, you did because God was with you, right? That also is an interesting selection about who's going to be a soldier. Remember that context. They go out to drink, and there was two positions. One, if a person, I think it was, if they lapped like a dog, they were to go home, if I remember correctly, one or the other. And the one here dipped their hand in and brought it to their mouth, they stayed. I've never once put my face down to a body of water and lapped like a dog. But I find it interesting that he points out that some people did, and he sends them all home. But anyway, but in verse 26, David makes his feelings very clear about the, as he calls him, the uncircumcised Philistine. Yes.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, these are men of war that have already conquered many battles. And it's not like Goliath was out there for just a few days. It said that he was out there for 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah.
So it's not like Goliath was out there a day and then just trying to work up the courage. He's been out there for over a month. And then in verse number 25, it says that they were sore afraid. It's not just a little bit of fear. I mean,
Yeah, they were terrified.
God.
Yeah.
And then you think about it today, there could be people that are doing so much good for the kingdom, but then there's something in their life that they're afraid of. But then it's interesting in verse number 26, because David's almost saying, like, the audacity of this guy to defy the living God.
Mm-hmm.
But today, sometimes we can be doing so much for God, and then something scares us,
Yeah.
and we kind of back off. But, like, the audacity of something to defy God, how audacious,
Yeah.
how audacious is that? Because God is the one that spoke the very universe into existence.
Yeah, we can get spooked, right? Yeah. You know, we knock on doors sometimes, like we did a couple of weeks ago, and depending on who comes to the door, you might get spooked. At least not the one, like the third door we knocked on over here. There's a sign on the door. It said, knock before you enter. Dog will bite you. And I went, I'm not going inside. So I knocked and stood back, and there was a little window in the door, and that dog was like the size of a horse. Nobody ever came to the door. Now, we left our stuff there, and whoever comes back sees it. But there's all kinds of reasons if we allow them. Let me put it this way. There's all kinds of excuses that can cause us to get afraid, right? You know, up until a couple of years ago when I started doing mission trips, I had never done door knocking or passing out stuff and talking to people. But we can't be afraid, right? I remember a couple of years ago, I don't mean to keep giving stories, but I'm old and that's what I do. But we were overseas, and Chuck was there with us this time, and I was talking to these three guys on the street, and I thought, man, they're sounding kind of funny. Even for speaking Marshallese, I didn't know what they were really saying. And so Chuck came over, and we were talking to him, and about 30 seconds later, I realized, oh, these guys are drunk off their mind, right? They've been intoxicated, been drinking, and as we talk to them, it comes out they've been drinking for a while. And so you can't get anywhere with a drunk. And so we talked to him for a second. We said, hey, when you're sober up, and that's actually what Chuck said, when you sober up, come to the church building. Now, you could have been afraid. We could have been afraid and said, we'll see you guys later, and just left. But we didn't, right? There's all kinds of reasons to get afraid. But are they ever any good? You know, with David and the Philistine, and David and with the armies of God and Goliath, was there, and to Dan's point, these guys have fought battles before, right? They probably have seen all kinds of crazy stuff in battle before, and guys being killed and doing all kinds of things. And so Goliath should have just been another guy, right? But instead, we find that he most definitely strikes fear in their heart, right? Verse 28 through 30.
Russ,
Yes.
just real quick, the fear of these men, that's a choice that they're making
Yes.
to have. Now, the danger is real. The danger is a possibility. But David overlooks that. He says, like you said, if God before us, who can be against us?
Mm-hmm.
That's his motive. He sees it as a task that needs to be done. There's no fear involved with David here.
Mm-hmm. And you're right, fear is an option. It is a choice that we make to be afraid, right? I'm sure we all know, I can think of things in the past that I think, boy, I was terrified about doing that, you know. It may be something nobody else would be afraid of. Buying your first house when we moved to Oklahoma. I've never done this before. You know, selling your house, moving up here, and buying another house. Never done that before. Never selling and buying. I know JJ would tell you, it's a lot of fun. No, it's not. But we do things that can cause us to be afraid, right? But we have to. When Christ was in the garden praying, was he afraid? Yeah. But did that stop him from going? And what's interesting is Christ, in my opinion, he wasn't afraid of the men. They didn't face him at all, right? They didn't even face Peter, who went off and missed a guy and hit his ear instead, right? What Christ knew was going to happen, the amount of pain. And I think in the past, I've kind of limited his pain to physical, the scourging, horrible, and then the actual crucifixion. But beyond that, on the cross, what did Christ carry? The sins of all mankind, past, present, and whoever would come in the future. That had, in my opinion, that has to factor into the pain that he was not looking forward to. Not looking forward to something and being afraid, they're not the same things, right? Christ wasn't looking forward to the torture that was scourging, the torture that was the crucifixion. You remember the crucifixion was so bad when they recommended that to Pilate, he said, why and what evil has he done? And many commentators say the reason he said that was because crucifixion was the worst way to die. Now, we go back to David and the uncircumcised Philistine, as he refers to him as. In verse 28 through 30, David is also known for having, there's a lot of phrases of David that are well known, but one of them also is one that is very popular. I think we sing a song to it sometimes. He says, the battle belongs to the Lord, right? David knew that, didn't he? That's why he wasn't afraid of the Philistine. I got 5 minutes? Okay. Verse 28 through 30. Real quickly. Now, Elab, how you want to say his name, his oldest brother heard when he spoke to the men, and Elab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? You notice he goes to anger, and then he goes to accusing him of doing something wrong, right? Do you remember what did the Bible say David did with the sheep before he left? He attended to them, right? He knows his role. And so the brother, when he says this, when he says, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? He is downplaying David's role. He's insulting him, saying, you are so insignificant. Maybe that's why I had in here earlier about how the youngest could be a reference to the least significant, because his brother here is saying, you have a few sheep and you just wandered off and came up here to see the battle? That's what he's saying there in verse 28, right? He's accusing him. What a great brother, right? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Wow, that's a slap in the face. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? I can't help but laugh when David says it. What have I done now? Right? He hasn't done anything. Look at verse 30. Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. What happens? They all turn against David. Why? I'll say this. David is making them look bad. And he hasn't even gone to battle yet. Right? The first thing David says when he comes up there is, what I get for killing that guy. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting how, and you mentioned earlier how many excuses he could have made throughout all of this. You have the idea of him coming up here anyway and being the youngest, and like all of these people who are bigger than him can't handle it. He should be like, they should have to do it themselves. Why should I have to get into this?
Yeah.
And then the fear, and then right here when Eli is calling him prideful for even coming up here,
he didn't make excuses, and he also. It's interesting how when David comes up, that the first thing to do is they turn on him. When he asks, "What are you doing here?" and the first thing they say is, "Well, you just came to see the battle, right?" They snap out of fear because when you embarrass sometimes, or we feel like you're being attacked, like with David, or not with David, with his brothers here. Maybe that's why they said this. You just came up to see the battle. Where's those few sheep you take care of, right? They're insulting him the whole entire time. And yet David is the only one who asks when he comes up there, "What do I get when I kill the guy?" Now, they announce it previously, kind of make in the general statements everybody knows. But when David asks, he asks for a reason. Why? Right? Because in his response, when he's asking, he reveals who this guy was. He's defying Israel. He's an uncircumcised Philistine. What else does he say? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he defies the armies of the living God? He has brought reproach upon Israel, verse 26. That definitely rubbed them the wrong way, didn't it? And so what do? You're right, David. We should go out and we should try to kill this guy. Now they say, "You shouldn't even be up here," right? I got 2 older brothers. Sometimes we acted in similar ways. Just go home. You're too little for this. When you're the youngest brother, you're always a little brother. Yes.
So it's interesting on that point. Eliab was so embarrassed by what David was doing that he really made up a lie.
Mm-hmm.
David had killed the lion. David had killed the bear. But did David say he did it?
Yeah.
No, he said God did.
Yeah.
Right? He was not right in that way at that time.
Yeah.
And so for Eliab to say that, he was obviously embarrassed because he made up a lie to try to knock David down.
Yeah. They deflect. He deflects pretty quickly, right? He turns against David and says, instead of asking, "Okay, David, what do you think we should do? How do we handle this guy?" To your point, he just deflects, which is a human response, right? When we're embarrassed, I think there's not only fear but also embarrassment there because they knew they shouldn't be standing there. All right, let's stop there, and we'll take our break, and we'll come back at 7:05, and we'll look at the second half of our lesson. Yeah, I get enough.
I try to make it so that you don't have to just do that.
Well, I just drew it out a little bit, and no, it's good to go. Yes. Yep. Yeah. I know. Are you doing the remote control thing? Is that you? Are you doing the remote access?
I am not.
Okay. I was using that to watch the slides, and somebody hopped on and kicked me off, so
Oh, okay. Yeah,
that's fine. It doesn't matter.
I don't know who's supposed to be. I think Johnny was. This
it's about time for us to get started for a second hour. I know we still have some here eating cookies, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we're going to run out of time. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 31 through 37 is going to be what we cover for the remaining of our time together. So, apparently, Brendan gets to teach on Goliath tomorrow, so, yes. I'm about to, yes. Okay. Okay, I'll try to talk loud. All right, so let's go and get to our second sermon. I heard that. No more cookies for her. Verse 31 through 37, I've kind of titled here, David's Faith in Action. There's a lot of different ways you can title a lot of these sections, and so I don't really stick too much to any of these, but really the theme for the second portion of our class is how bold faith grows from experience with God, not from personal strength. And what we mean by that is David's victory that we know is going to come later is a result of not of his physical strength, but of his trust and obedience in God, in the strength that God gives him. So we look at verse 31. We look at here David's challenge is taken seriously in verse 31. But we're going to back up for just a second and read a few of these things that help us lead up to verse 31. So let's back up to verse 28. Now Edom, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Edom's anger was aroused against David, and said, "Why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones. Now we're in verse 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. So David is called to Saul because of what he said. And we saw earlier what he said was, what's the price of killing the Philistine? His brother questions him and kind of chastises him. David responds in similar fashion to others. And now we find in verse 31 that Saul has asked to see him. What's interesting, as we'll see here in a few moments, is that Saul does not scare David. He could have crumbled underneath the pressure of talking to Saul because of the position he was in, right? He was the leader of the army. He was no doubt a leader among Israel. And so when he's called to Saul, no doubt he could have faltered. He could have backed down from what he had said about Goliath, and he could have just went on home and went back to the sheep. But that's not what happens, right? In Proverbs chapter 18, in verse 16 says, "A man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men." Now, in context, some might say, well, that's talking about bringing a gift and giving a gift to the king, and that's why I got to have an audience with the king. But I think here the gift of David, if we want to apply it here to this context, is his courage. And his faith in God, and his courage that is on display, even before he goes out to face Goliath. And no doubt that's one of the reasons, at least one of the reasons why that Saul sent for him, as we see there in verse 31. In verse 32 through 36, you have David's confidence in God. In verses 32 through 36, someone want to read verse 32 of 1 Samuel chapter 17.
David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
And so David goes to Saul and he tells him to not be afraid, right? That's his message to the leader of the army. Is it brave on David's part to tell the leader, don't be afraid? Because doesn't that imply the leader is afraid? You don't tell people who aren't scared not to be scared. You tell people who are afraid not to be afraid. And so when he tells him in verse 32, let no man's heart fail because of him, a reference to Goliath, then he says, your servant will go and fight this Philistine. David's not a soldier, is he? He's not in the army. Only his 3 oldest brothers, as we pointed out in the first hour, are there fighting, right? And so when David says this in verse 32, we find here that despite his age, and as we'll talk about, well, as Brandon gets to talk about tomorrow, Goliath points out his size, doesn't he? Go ahead, Nan.
I just think it's interesting that, like, demeanor of David and how humble he was. In verse number 32, he says that he is a servant. In 28, whenever his brothers were lashing out against him, he didn't strike back. He, just took it humbly. He did what his father told him. And then, we'll see in a few verses later that he gave God the glory for what he did.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just interesting to see, like, the character of someone. And, like in the New Testament, it says, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. And we know that's not the thing on this earth, but we need to be humble. And then you look at David, he was humble in God's sight. He beats Goliath, he, goes out and slays these men, and he becomes a king. Whenever you do that which is right, God is going to bless you. Not necessarily again in this life, but whenever you're, having that humble attitude and giving God the praise and the glory, he will bless you more than
Yeah.
ever.
And to David's credit, as we mentioned earlier, when he goes out and gets the victory, and we know, as I said before, one of the greatest phrases of David is, the battle belongs to the Lord, right? And so, and to your point, he was humble, he was not arrogant. He doesn't even reply to his brothers in anger, he only asks, what have I done now? And then he ends up before the king, and he tells his king, it's almost like he's a parent talking to his child, saying, look, don't be afraid, I'll take care of this. He just doesn't quite say it that way, right? And to your point, David's going to be blessed because he puts his faith in God. He's going to be blessed because he trusts in him. And we know that at different periods in David's life, God does lift him up, right? Because he becomes a very big figure in the Old Testament. Were you going to say something, Johnny?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's interesting. It's kind of a window into Saul. Right?
Yeah.
As far as he's telling me, don't word like you're saying. He's telling him that because he's worried himself, and it's interesting. He's first king. Saul's first king here, right?
Yeah.
And so and then of course we know David would come next. But the whole thing about it is that's the attitude he should have been carrying on to his soldiers. To it doesn't matter how tall they are. If we're with God, we're going to be able to overcome.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's an interesting. It's kind of a glimpse, and we know what ends up happening with Saul. But maybe that's kind of the first evidence or lack of whatever, where he starts to kind of turn. He starts becoming more prideful. Right here, I think is very interesting because he tells him, "No, you can't do that. You need to basically go home."
I think also in many ways, you bring up Saul being the first king. He mirrors also in a lot of ways the feelings of the people.
Yes.
You remember the people, if you remember from, I believe it's the Judges, where the people asked for a king, right?
Right.
They asked for, now they don't necessarily ask for Saul, but remember they did ask for a king. God actually warns them, and they still said, give us a king so we can be like the nations around us, right? There's the danger right there. We want to be like everybody else. We want to have a king. Why do you need a king? You got God. You just don't listen to him. Well, they didn't listen to the king very well either, I'm sure. But Saul really, I think in many ways, his actions reflect the feelings of Israel in many ways, because they too were not very faithful. You've heard people say, and I've said it before, their faithfulness is like a roller coaster. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And it probably goes down a whole lot more than it goes up. But Saul mirrors that, and we find here that's why David, and let's be honest, David when he came to see what was going on, the report should have been, yeah, we killed a Philistine. That should have been the report. But that wasn't the report. And so that's why David goes to Saul and says and tells him, and I look at it almost in a condescending way. I really doubt that's how he said it. But he tells Saul, the king, not to be afraid. Which, to your point, it sounds crazy. Why is a king afraid? He shouldn't be afraid. That's the last guy you want afraid is a king, because it goes out to everybody else. If the king is afraid, if the president of our nation was afraid of another nation and said so publicly, everybody else would be afraid too, wouldn't they? So when the king is afraid, not necessarily by his words, but by his actions, because Goliath's still out there, only says one thing, he's chicken. And what happens? Everybody else is too. And so David says what he does in verse 32. He says there, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. He really tries to, in many ways, comfort Saul and also remind him that, look, I'm your servant. Let your servant, you'll take care of the guy. And so there's a lot of ways to look at it, but the part about don't be afraid to me could be a little bit demeaning, but he kind of covers that by saying, referring to himself as his servant, he will go out and do this basically on your behalf, right? So despite his age, his words, no doubt, in verse 32 carry what should have been peace and strength. Faith, like David's, should bring assurance and encouragement. But as Johnny alluded to a little bit later, after David kills Goliath, Saul just becomes a different person, right? Instead of saying, yeah, look at my servant, he's killing everybody. You know, he doesn't applaud him, he doesn't lift him up, he just says, well, they're singing songs about David and blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe if you're a better king, you wouldn't worry so much about that. And then the outcome would have been totally different, but we're getting way ahead of ourselves. How might our words help others be brave in difficult times? How might our words help others be brave in difficult times? Go ahead, Brandon.
You know, it's sometimes that light someone else can bring that shows encouragement where everyone thinks something might be impossible, or they might think there's no outcome here other than death. For someone to say, no, it is possible.
Yeah.
And we have God on our side. And in any situation, if there's absolution of defeat, everybody's going to be, afraid, scared. There's no way out. But I think it's even through temptation in our lives, when it's talked about, I think it's 1 Corinthians 10:13, God makes a way of escape. There's always a way out.
Yeah.
There's always a path to go for good. There's never something that we can't overcome. That's just simply it.
You know, I think sometimes we, as I said before, there's a lot of excuses when it comes to reasons why we might be afraid. In some instances in life, I think we have to realize that the only way that we get over our fear is we go through it. The only way to get over Goliath is to go through him, right? Physically, spiritually as well, go through the guy. Because the only one who doubted they could do it was them. God definitely didn't doubt it. I mean, Goliath, give me a break. Go ahead.
I think another important way to overcome trying times, at least for me, is to pray. Not just because it's important to pray to God, but whenever you take a step back and realize that God's on your side, because whenever you feel like you can't go through things, for me at least, the biggest reason is because sometimes I'm thinking about me versus this situation versus me and God versus this situation.
Yes.
I think it's so important to pray because whenever you take a step back and realize that God's there with you, you realize, okay, it's not me that's going through and trying to beat this situation, it's me and God. Because at the end of the day, that's where your strength is going to come from. And that's why David was able to slay Goliath. He was the only one that was remembering that.
Yeah, they've forgotten, to your point, an excellent point, they forgot who's with them, right? If they would have stopped, and to your point, and said, what are we afraid of? God's with us, right? Maybe repent for them lacking and not taking care of this sooner. What would happen? They would have killed them all, right? It would have been just David going out. It would have been all of them going out the very first time. And so that's an excellent point, because we do sometimes forget, especially in the midst of uncertain times, scary times, we forget who's with us. It's God, right? You know, we think about, and there's so many examples, but we think about men who did not do that, right? The contrast of it. The three friends and Daniel, they knew God was with them. They knew God's will be carried out one way or the other. So what happened? They were willing to go to the fiery furnace because they knew who they served, right? Same way with Daniel in the lion's den. Might he not fear the lion's den? He knew who he served because he prayed to him every day, right? Multiple times a day. That actually was the reason he was in the lion's den, right? But he knew who he served. And to Nan's point here in 1 Samuel 17, it would appear, at least for the time, these people forgot who was on their side in the first place. If they would have just kept their faith in God, David would have no reason to come up. We wouldn't have chapter 17 because Goliath would have been killed already, right? We probably would have read, a giant came up and we slew him. Next, right? Because that's pretty much how it should have read. You know, we read about, for example, I'm just going to find the verse here. Romans 8:31. What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Now, we're talking about in context there, difficult times and persecution, things like that. But in David's time period, could the same thing be said? If God is for us, and he was, who can be against us? Only people we're about to kill, right? And so the same idea. Yes.
I think this is a good example. Like you said, wouldn't it be 1 Samuel 17? I think that's a great point because when you think about it, you know, sometimes we go through things and maybe those are temptations or whatever, and we're like, man, should I do this? Should I not? We spend so much time on looking at maybe justifications or whatever the case might be instead of just looking at it and saying, well, God says I shouldn't do it, so all those thoughts that I thought about really don't matter anymore. They
Yeah.
should be God's word. And so, you know, here, if they would have faith in God, then you're exactly right. It would just been another battle.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of sections of the Bible that wouldn't exist if people would just done what they're supposed to in the first place. Jonah would have been a very short book, right? There would have been no great fish because Jonah would have went to Nineveh in chapter 1, right? But we look at verse 33 through 36. Someone wants to read that. 1 Samuel 17, 33 through 36.
And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against the Philistines to fight me, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from Egypt. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. 36 as well.
Yeah, 36.
Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God.
Now, I don't get to talk about Goliath tomorrow, so I'm going to use a phrase here. This is a very much a Braveheart speech kind of moment, isn't it? You know, do you remember when, I mean, I don't reference it too much because there's things in the movie it's not good, but there's a lot of movies like Braveheart and others where there's a point where they come out and they make a big speech, everybody gets rallied up and ready to go. That's what David was doing to Saul, one-on-one. He's nothing. He's saying, you know, if I can kill the bear, the lion, all these things, Philistines just like him, right? But before we get into all that, look at verse 33. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against a Philistine to fight with him. In what sense is he right? If David was by himself without God, he couldn't, could he? He's right if that was the case, but that's not the case, is it? You are not able to go up against this Philistine to fight him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. So he's been a soldier for longer than you've been alive, David. So, right?
Conventional knowledge that Saul had, no, it wouldn't be a chance for this kid to go
No.
up against him. And everyone that was there saw that this was a youth. He was ruddy in complexion. I guess that means red hair, light complexion, half the size of Goliath. Conventional wisdom would say no.
Yeah.
He's going to swat you like a fly.
Yeah.
But they weren't
And that goes back to what Dan was saying before. Can David defeat Goliath on his own? Well, as you said, logically, no, he can't. He's a small youth. He is a shepherd boy, right? I don't know how much of a boy he was, but he's very young. And so, but what's interesting here is we see in verse 33, Saul said to David, you can't do it. But Saul's reply, or David's reply rather in verse 34 is, he says, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. Okay, I don't care who you are. I'm not messing with that guy. If you're killing a lion and a bear, we're good. I'm not crossing you. Because that's pretty, that's not fear, is it? If you're going to be afraid of something, I'm going to be afraid of a lion and bear. And probably, if I'm honest, Goliath too. But David's not that way, is he? He says, whenever it happened, now notice this, he says, verse 35, I went out after it. He pursued it. He hunted those things down and killed it and brought out the lamb alive. That's pretty impressive. I don't care who you are. And that's why David says that. I don't think he's boasting. He's just saying, look, this isn't my first rodeo, so to speak, right? I've killed things before. I've killed big, scary things before. Go ahead.
He's just basically saying, I did my job.
Yeah.
It didn't matter what obstacle there was.
Mm-hmm.
I delivered my duty out of the lion's mouth.
Yeah. And to your point, their duty was to kill Goliath. That wasn't the only one, but he was included in it, right? That was just a part that, we'll fight the Philistines, but Goliath, we're still afraid of him. But Goliath wasn't going anywhere, right? As we were already pointing out, he was there for, 40 days? A long time, talking trash the whole time. And it takes David, a little shepherd boy who is underrated, right? There's a lot of underdog stories in the Bible. David's one of them. And this is one of them right here. Because what happens should not have happened. It's kind of like Rocky beating Apollo in Rocky 2 shouldn't have happened. But he did. He definitely shouldn't have beat the Russians, sorry. But here with David, he should not have been able to kill Goliath with a stone and a sling. Now, I've heard about guys using stones. We actually talked about this in the Bible class one night, about guys who have a sling and a certain kind of sling like him, and they could throw it like super far, right? And so that's why when you read about the stone sinking in the guy's head, that's very, very, very possible, right? But you look at verse 35. He says he went out, he hunted these things down, he killed them, and he says here, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. David didn't have a rifle, did he? Caught it by its beard means he is doing it hand on hand. I'm not messing with David. You can call him ruddy and little all you want. I'm not messing with that guy. But also, to Brandon's point, that's also probably why he was guarding the sheep too, right? It's why I knew who to put out there. Look at verse 36. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine, there's that insult again, and showing who he really thinks this guy is, will be like one of them. Up until this point, I don't know if he ever does, he doesn't ever refer to Goliath by name. He just calls him what he is, an uncircumcised Philistine. That's all he is. Don't call him Goliath. Don't give him some kind of due by calling him by name. He's just another uncircumcised Philistine who he says is going to be like the lion and the bear. He's going to kill them both, right? He says he will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. He tells him why he's going to do these things. Not because David's awesome and David wants to do it and prove a point, but it's because of what this Philistine is doing. He's going out and he's defying and rebelling against the armies of God. That was why Goliath had to die, because of what he was doing. Yes?
It's interesting because David's perspective wasn't a challenge to Saul.
Mm-hmm.
David's perspective was being the servant of God.
Yeah. Yeah. David, by him talking to the king and saying these things, he's giving the king opportunities to say, you know what, no, we need to step up, we need to do this, right? By him telling the king that, look, this is possible, first of all, back in verse, 32? He says, it's possible to kill Goliath, it's possible to kill that Philistine. That's the first thing he says. He's don't be afraid, your servant will kill him, because why? Because it's not beyond It's not beyond anybody's ability. And when Saul replies and says, "You're just a youth, and this guy's been fighting, being a soldier basically longer than you've been alive," and David says, "I'll kill him like I've killed everything else." That should spur Saul on to say, "You know what? You're right." But that's not what happened, though, was it? You keep reading there. We know as we keep reading there later, we read about how, the armor and things like that. Verse 38, so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. Verse 39, he doesn't use it, though, right, because he hasn't tested them. Don't worry, Brandon, that's as far as I'm going to go. That's your lesson tomorrow. But he hasn't tested those things, which tells us little David is going out without any armor. Do you remember how long it talks about Goliath's armor? It talks about the massive sword he had. It talks about all the helmet, the breastplate, all of those things he had. It talks about the weight of them all. He was armored to the hilt, we might say, right? And David doesn't wear anything, any armor at all. You know how crazy that is? You don't ever see knights in all these medieval movies that I like to watch sometimes. If a knight took his armor off and ran into battle with just, his undershirt and a sword, he's going to be dead in 10 seconds, right? But that's not what happens with David. He leaves the armor aside and he goes to Goliath anyway. He was not afraid, is the point I'm trying to make here. He didn't care about being called young and inexperienced in verse 33. Instead, he recounts how he killed a lion and a bear, verse 34 through 36. And he just simply says, we look at verse 36. He says, "Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God," right? He delivered, he says, "He delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the bear." Who does he give the glory to in killing the animals? God, right? Which is exactly why Saul could kill the Philistine. Because he put his faith in God. Saul never said that. He just says, "You're too little." David's response is, "God delivered the lion and the bear. What makes you think he won't deliver the Philistine?" You'd think that would click in Saul's mind. God's going to deliver the Philistine to me. It's not about me, because that's what Saul is thinking about, right? Yes.
I think the fact that he's so confident is directly connected to his ability not to forget, right? He can recall the times in which God delivered him from the past, and those are directly feeding his faith and his confidence.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the human condition, and God knows that about us, that
Yes.
we often forget.
Yeah.
And so, the people of Israel, he had so many, feasts, or he had the Passover to constantly remind them, remember
Yes.
what I've done for you.
Mhm.
Now we take the Lord's Supper every week.
Mhm.
Don't forget the power in the resurrection of Christ, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a clear connection between his ability to remember what God did for him in the past that gives him confidence to know what he can do with slaying Goliath.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point, because especially in the Old Testament, it's not any different today, but people forget how quickly, how much God has done for them, right? From the time they crossed the Red Sea to the time that Moses goes up to receive the Ten Commandments, it's not very long. But they forgot. I think most historians say he was there maybe 30 days. 30 days, they went from serving the God who dried and split the river, the sea, and brought them across to, "Hey, Aaron, make us a golden calf." Aaron should have slapped him silly, shouldn't he? Because he should have said, "Do you not remember what we just did?" Because you remember when they crossed the Red Sea, to your point, they made what? They put up a altar or a stack of stones, so that when people say, "Hey, what's this about?" they could say, "This is what it's about," and talk about the crossing of the sea, right? Because people, to your point, forget. And sometimes we forget pretty quick. Yes?
I was also thinking, it says there, uncircumcised Philistine, a couple of different times. And more than just an insult, I think it was also just a reminder that David was part of a covenant with God, and that circumcision was part of that sign of that covenant.
Yes.
And the Philistine was not.
Yeah.
And so just kind of, saying he's not part of God's covenant.
Yeah. Yeah. Remember who he is, right? He's not one of us. He's rebellious. We're circumcised. We all belong to God who are circumcised, unlike this guy, right? Yeah, excellent point. Yes.
Brandon, hopefully I'm not getting into your lesson. I think it's interesting, or something to point out is he's very confident in his words and everything like that. Then he moves forward with it. It's not like, okay, and then it comes to the time and it's like, oh, I can't do this.
Yeah.
It's like his actions absolutely represented what his words said.
Yeah.
And just the application that we have for us today.
Yeah, he said he was going to do it, and then he did it.
Yeah.
He followed through, right, which is huge. Because everybody can talk big and act tough, but when it comes down to it, if you don't do it, nobody cares. You know, God doesn't care. You can say, oh, I'm going to do this, this, and this, but you don't ever do it. Empty words, right? You know? You got to be kidding me.
Cat's out of the bag, I guess Goliath dies then, right?
Yeah, spoiler alert, he loses his head. There's not a part 2 to David and Goliath. There's no sequel. I got 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we can stretch it to 10. That's what that means, right? So 34 through 36, David tells Saul rather one of the reasons why he's not afraid, because God's delivered him. He's been with him in the past. He's going to be with him in the future, right? That should have been, as we've already mentioned, something that rang the memory of Saul. And you're right, he's been with us, but it doesn't. It just says David snatched lambs from danger. Would God rescue his people here in 1 Samuel 17? Yeah. It wasn't David who was going to be doing the rescuing, it was God, right? You remember, and I'm just stepping off through your lesson, but you remember when David is charging Goliath, and Goliath says, you know, I'm going to feed your body to the birds of the air and all this stuff. And as David is, my memory serves me correctly, David says this as he's charging Goliath, that he's going to feed him, or he's going to remove his head, right? I'm paraphrasing. And he's going to take him down. And the next thing you read about is that crazy stone going around that guy's head. This is why I was hoping to have Goliath, but anyway. But we go back to David leading up to this. He never shows any fear. His only question is repeated in different ways, and by his statements repeats it as well. He's basically asking, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? He's just a Philistine. As Tina pointed out, he's not one of us. He's not one of us. He's rebellious. He is wicked, and he has an army with him. But, you know, if you take out Goliath, unknowingly put himself also in a bad position, because when he came out, if he lost, well, we know what happens, right? His army runs, right? You also remember the Bible says that David and the army of Israel pursued them, and it always says, you know, they pursued them all the way to up and up in such a place, and they kill them all, right? If Goliath had not come out, they just went to battle, his army would have never fled. But because he came out and challenged them, and then David comes out and kills him, and then removes his head, the fear moves from Israel to the army of the Philistines. Because when you see your leader, this massive guy, get taken down to that little guy, what are you going to do? You're going to run. Because the next question is going to pop in your head, at least if I was that, are they all like that guy? Because if they are, I'm out of here. And what they do, they run, right? And so we look at verse 37. Verse 37, David, again, as we've already mentioned this before, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Well, don't worry, Saul, he is, right? The question in my mind is, are you with the Lord at that point, Saul? Because Saul should have been right there with him. You know, if anything, it should have been Saul and David going out together to face the giant. Go ahead.
I think another thing about David with this situation, David the shepherd boy, it reminds me of, you know, whenever Paul was writing to Timothy and said, let no man despise thy youth.
Mm-hmm.
David didn't, you know, he wasn't afraid because he was young, but he also didn't give people an occasion to think less of him because he's young. Whenever you're a young, you know, Christian, you need to make sure that you are doing
You know what's interesting also, and that's an excellent point, is we still have people today who will look down on individuals because of their youth, right? When my first full-time preaching job, I was there at this location. There was a funeral, and the preacher who came in was going to do the funeral, came up to me and shook his hand. I never met this guy before in my life. And he said, "Oh yeah, these young preachers don't know what it's like to preach a hard sermon." I never met this guy from anybody. Now, because I'm always so calm and collective, I said, "Well, a preacher who's worth his salt has no problem with a hard sermon." And he didn't say anything about it. But the point being was he acted the same way like the brothers here, right? You're just little, you're just young, you can't do these things. Well, that's not true. Go ahead, Trent.
I think it's funny if you go to try not to step on your lesson.
We already had, don't worry about it.
We've already done that. It says in verse 43, the Philistines said unto David, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves?" He severely underestimated David.
Yeah.
He just saw him as someone who could come up to him and beat him like a dog, but he didn't see who was behind him.
Yeah.
He had something that has overcome armies, has overcome armor and any nation that went against it, and that's God behind him.
Yeah. Yeah, to your point, and that's an excellent point, because Goliath didn't know about the lion and the bear. But more important, he didn't know who delivered the lion and the bear, right? And that's why David got the victory. Any comments or questions, because we are out of time?
No class tomorrow.
Okay, yeah. We'll just replay this. It'll be all right. All right. Thank you for your time and for your attention. You want this back over here?